A listener production.
We're now just days away from Donald Trump returning for his second term as President of the United States. And Trump has been talking a pretty big game about expanding US territory. He's going to buy Greenland, turn Canada into the 51st US state, occupy the Panama Canal and rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. Trump says a lot of batshit crazy things that he doesn't end up doing, but he does sometimes follow through. So today we're asking, could he actually do any of this? And what would happen if he did? To help answer those questions and more, our very own Bension Siebert is here. Bension, help me understand exactly what's going on here. Why is Trump suddenly talking about taking over other countries?
Well, because he wants the leaders of other countries to think he's batshit crazy. Stay with me for a second. This is called the madman theory of foreign relations, and this is where you play chicken with arguably insane threats in the hope that the other side backs down or thinks that you're strong and dangerous. You might remember in Trump's first term, he tweeted at North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un that his nuclear button is much bigger than Kim's nuclear button.
Tonight, the president called Kim's bluff with this tweet. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I too have a nuclear button, but it is a much bigger and more powerful one than his, and my button works.
I remember thinking at the time, stop that. Stop that right now. I don't want to be in a nuclear holocaust. But this time, Trump is threatening to, among other things, take Greenland or buy Greenland, potentially even using military force. And this is the same week he's suggested annexing Canada, taking over the Panama Canal, as you mentioned, and renaming the Gulf of Mexico, which does sound pretty crazy. The problem with the madman strategy, though, is that at some point, people call your bullshit and you have to actually do one or two or a bunch of the crazy things that you've been threatening to do in order to maintain this facade that you are, in fact, this wild operator.
Yeah, so otherwise it looks like you're all talk and no bite. Let's get to them in order. Talk to us about why Trump wants Greenland.
Well, let's not forget that Trump is a real estate developer at heart, and he very much brought that energy when he first floated this idea of buying Greenland in his first term as president.
Essentially, it's a large real estate deal. It's hurting Denmark very badly because they're losing almost $700 million a year carrying it. And strategically for the United States, it would be nice.
Now, there are some genuine security reasons that the US might want to own Greenland, but let's just stick on this real estate theme for just a moment. Greenland has over 2 million square kilometres of land, mostly covered in ice. It's about a quarter of the size of the United States, but with a potentially unimaginably large amount of oil and gas and various resources that could be really vital to the 21st century economy, making chips, making phones, making computers. And those resources are becoming more and more accessible because the ice is melting because of climate change. Greenland also holds some of the largest reserves of rare earth elements. So there's a lot of cash for any country who potentially can use those resources. But it's not all about the resources, and it's not actually like a New York real estate deal here. Greenland is a mostly independent state of about 55,000 people, 90% of whom are Inuit Indigenous people. They have an independent parliament, a prime minister, but for over 300 years, Greenland has been effectively owned by Denmark. And so when Trump first floated this idea, the president of Denmark said that the idea was absurd, and she hoped Trump wasn't being serious and said Greenland is not for sale. Trump promptly had a bit of a sulk about this, called her nasty, and that was about the end of it until last week when he raised it again, and this time it sounds more serious because he's threatening to use US military and certainly economic force against Denmark if it fails to hand over Greenland.
Well, we need Greenland for national security. That's for the free world. I'm talking about protecting the free world. You don't even need binoculars. You look outside, you have China ships all over the place. You have Russian ships all over the place. We're not letting that happen.
But to understand why Greenland is important enough for Trump to be raising it at all, you've kind of got to imagine it on a map. And unfortunately, we're in audio, so this isn't ideal, but stay with me here. On the continent of North America, you have the United States to the south and Canada to the north, with Alaska a bit. And then you keep on going north and east, and there's Greenland, this big icy triangle. And then keep on going east, and then you have Russia. And that's where the security part of this comes in. The US already has a military base in Greenland, which is used for missile warnings in case Russia sends a missile, satellite command, and space surveillance, which is operated by another one of Trump's innovations. You might remember the US Space Force. So Greenland is and could be an important part of US defense against some future Russian attack. And as I mentioned before, climate change is a factor here. Because Greenland's ice sheets are shrinking by some 270 billion tonnes per year, in the short term, less ice in that part of the world means easier mining of resources, faster shipping routes, and both China and Russia are really keen to jostle for control over this part of the world, the Arctic region.
And you can understand the pull, I suppose, of wanting to do that as a leader like Trump is and how we know he can be. But if Greenland has all these resources, a tiny population, and it's in this strategic spot, have we actually seen anyone try to buy it before?
Yeah, Trump is actually the third US president to have a go at buying Greenland. About 150 years ago, then President Andrew Johnson wanted Greenland for its fish and minerals, but no dice for Andrew. And during the Cold War between the US and Soviet Russia, US President Harry Truman offered Denmark $100 million in gold for Greenland. This was all secret because it was happening during the Cold War. When Truman made his bid, he wanted Greenland in case Soviet bombers were going to fly over the Arctic Circle. So same kind of security risk stuff. And obviously now with Russia's war in Ukraine, things are quite tense. And the US would like the most advantage it possibly can have in those circumstances.
The idea of buying a country just sounds so absurd. Can he actually do it?
Yeah, look, to simply buy it like a piece of New York real estate, for example, Trump would have to have the governments of both Greenland and Denmark on side, and they very much are not on side, which leaves him with these economic coercion threats, the tariffs that he says he's going to impose on Danish exports, or the real madman option, which is actual military invasion of Greenland by the US. All that said, though, the US does have a long history of buying very large tracts of land in order to expand its territory. In fact, more than half of the land that we now call the United States of America was literally bought by the US government, including Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Johnson. And over 100 years ago, then President Woodrow Wilson bought the Danish West Indies for $25 million off Denmark. Those are now called the US Virgin Islands, so it would not be entirely unprecedented.
Yeah, well, I guess you've made the point then that this has happened in the past and it could absolutely happen again. But Greenland isn't the only territory that Trump has been talking about taking over in the past week. Can you take us through some of the others?
Yeah, well, number one is Canada. We've spoken on this podcast recently about the fact that Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has put in his resignation after sliding into a deep unpopularity that was made worse by Trump's threats of a 25% tariff on Canadian goods. Now, soon after Trudeau announced his resignation, Trump got on his own personal social media platform, Truth Social, to suggest if Canada merged with the US, there'd be no tariffs and taxes would go down and they'd be totally secure.
It actually sort of came up at one point, and then we started musing back and forth about this. And when I started to suggest, well, maybe there could be a trade for Vermont or California for certain parts, he immediately decided that it was not that funny anymore, and we moved on to a different conversation.
Now, the quote in response from Trudeau was, "Snowflake's chance in hell of Canada ever becoming a US state." But the reality of the trade war between those two countries is very much real. Now, another random idea that Trump floated last week was that he was going to rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, but because it has, quote, a beautiful ring to it. Mexico's Prime Minister Claudia Sheinbaum responded by suggesting that we call the United States Mexican America.
America Mexicana.
Because that would sound nice, wouldn't it? She said, which kind of took the air out of that one.
Yeah.
But this is all a bit of a distraction because there's a very serious issue here that Trump has raised, and that's his threat to take over the Panama Canal.
Yeah, so I was watching this press conference on January 7 where he was asked about both Greenland and Panama Canal, and that seemed to be what the reporters were focusing on in their questions. Tell us about that. Tell us about what he's threatening and what it could mean.
So the Panama Canal is incredibly vital for all kinds of things because it's this tiny little pinch point of global trade and shipping where lots and lots and lots of stuff goes through, and Trump has now threatened to take it over by military force, which is a very serious threat. The Panama Canal was completed in 1914, and it's this huge shipping lane and used by the US and all kinds of other countries. And it cuts about 15,000 kilometres off routes that container ships would otherwise have to travel around the African continent. And the history of this is really interesting because the US actually paid for the cost of the project to build the Panama Canal, and then control of the canal passed to the Panama Canal Commission, a joint agency of the United States and the Republic of Panama, and complete control passed on to Panama at noon on December 31st, 1999. Trump thinks this was a huge mistake, and he falsely claimed that Panama also handed over the operation of this once mega US project to the Chinese.
The Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. And we gave the Panama Canal to Panama. We didn't give it to China. And they've abused it. They've abused that gift.
Just a fact check of that, a Hong Kong-based company does operate two of the ports on the ends of the canal, but the canal in its entirety is administered by an independent government agency, the Panama Canal Authority. Now, Trump's position is that the canal is a vital US resource both for national security and economic reasons, and that stance is expected to be popular with his voter base because of the hawks in his administration. So in practice, there are broadly two options for Donald Trump here. He could use economic means like tariffs, for example, or he could literally stage a military intervention here. So there obviously have been plenty of times in American history where the US has intervened quite spectacularly and often catastrophically in other countries, including the Republic of Panama. Like in 1990, President George Bush Sr. oversaw the ousting of the Panamanian president. It was a month-long military invasion called Operation Just Cause, which was launched under the pretext of protecting US interests and security in the region. It ultimately resulted in the deaths of 23 US soldiers and 150 Panamanian Defense Force personnel, along with 500 civilians. So if Trump were to go ahead and take it by military force, it would potentially be a disastrous thing on a human level. And it certainly wouldn't be good for the US's reputation in Latin America.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning too that Panama's president, Jose Raul Molino, has said about all of this, quote, "Every square metre of the Panama Canal and its adjoining zone is Panama's and will remain so. And Panamanian officials too have since called Panama's control of the waterway non-negotiable. So they are taking an extremely hard stance as well. But, as you have said throughout this chat, Bension, if the madman theory is to be successful, he needs to follow through on something. So I'm sure that they'll be watching his next moves very closely, especially once he's taking office. Thanks so much for bringing us this story.
Thanks, Sash.
That was Bension Siebert speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. Before you go, we'd love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. It is a really easy way you can support us and everything we do here at The Briefing. So is checking us out on socials and sharing our posts. We're on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.